Technology careers are not as accessible to certain demographics, such as women or minorities. Sarah Allen is working to change that through education and outreach. Sarah created RailsBridge and Bridge Foundry, a pair of organizations working to make technology more accessible to people who are underrepresented in technology. RailsBridge workshops are a fun and free way to get started with Ruby, Rails, or other technologies. RailsBridge was so successful that Sarah created Bridge Foundry, which has an even wider variety of free workshops, from Clojure to Go to mobile. This is an inspirational episode of Software Engineering Daily, and it's a great opportunity for anyone who is looking to learn how to build a community. Before we get to my conversation with Sarah, let's hear from a sponsor that keeps the lights on at Software Engineering Daily. As a software engineer, you have tremendous leverage in the employment market. Every company needs software engineers, and these companies are all competing for you, the engineer, a scarce resource. But as an individual engineer, you don't have much insight into this incredibly opaque market. That's where Hired.com comes in. Hired.com assigns you a talent advocate who works to understand your needs and works to find you the perfect job. Go to hired.com/SEDaily to try out the platform today and get a $2,000 bonus if you find a job. The companies on Hired compete for you, the engineer, and they make bids to win your talent. These are companies like Facebook and Uber, companies that we know are on the cutting edge of engineering because they've come on Software Engineering Daily to talk about their tech stack. I've used Hired personally, and I've experienced firsthand the ease of finding a well-paid, enjoyable job. This was way better than replying to LinkedIn messages from uninformed recruiters, and it was also certainly better than using a job search engine. To find a great job and support Software Engineering Daily, go to hired.com/SEDaily and get a $2,000 bonus upon finding a job. Check it out. It would support the show. Now let's get on with the show. Sarah Allen is the founder of RailsBridge and the leader of Bridge Foundry. These are two organizations working to make technology more accessible to people who are underrepresented in technology. And more generally, they are part of a learn to code movement that we're trying to cover on Software Engineering Daily. Sarah was on a previous episode talking about 18F. Sarah, welcome back to Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you. It's great to be here and talk about coding.
Yes, absolutely. So before we talk about RailsBridge and Bridge Foundry, let's talk more broadly about diversity. Why is it important to make tech more diverse?
That is a great question. There's a lot of research that supports that in general, diverse teams have better outcomes. They're more creative, you have more ideas. I also believe that of necessity, when you have a diverse team, you have to create a forum for discussion that allows for different opinions and different perspectives. And so there's been a lot of research that shows that in lots of different dimensions of diversity. The other thing about technology these days is software and hardware is becoming embedded in our world fundamentally different ways than it was 20, 30, 50 years ago. And if we don't have all of the people represented in the creation activities, I don't believe we're going to end up with the solutions that we need for our society.
So more opportunities, the power set of potential things that we can explore is so giant. We need all the help we can get and all the different perspectives to explore these different avenues of technological advance.
Exactly. And I think the other point is very simply, we have a talent crunch and we're not looking at all the prospective talent.
In terms of the talent crunch, I find this interesting. I feel like we are in what may be a permanent transition from this economy of mostly kind of the service worker economy and the industrial, like assembly line, manual labor, commodity worker economy to the knowledge worker economy. And I think it's almost impossible to understate how crucial this transition is. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that is analogous to the Industrial Revolution, where we changed how our society functions. We changed the definition of work. We changed a lot of how individuals contributed to society with the Industrial Revolution. And I think that now it's a challenge for society, but I also think it's an opportunity. It means that we have to, it's a economic necessity to have a more educated populace.
So given that it is an economic necessity, I mean, this kind of the idea of the Industrial Revolution was that, it was an economic necessity that we taught people some degree of compliance, some degree of ability to work together. Not, and I don't say this in a critical fashion, it was just we had a lot of assembly line type jobs, so that got baked into the education system because that is what people got hired for, was the ability to fulfill these types of jobs. But that job desirability landscape has changed. So given that change, what are the first principles of education, and particularly like coding technology education, that we need to start thinking about and baking into our educational processes?
One of the things that I find that I think is not baked into a lot of our educational processes, and most people don't think about in terms of coding, is that we really need good thinkers. We need good problem solvers. We need people who have incredibly good communication skills. And this is not something that people normally think of when they think of coders. They think of people who, sit alone in their room and type a lot and come up with these amazing things that
the lone genius.
Exactly. And while there's still opportunity for individuals who like to work that way to contribute, the majority of software development is team sport. And the other thing is that we see a lot of software that fails because people don't understand the problem that they're solving. And the more that we compartmentalize the people who talk to people versus the coders, the more that we are ineffective at having the coders really understand the problem that they're solving. And then they don't necessarily come up with a solution that will work in the market and will work for the people. And so these new, not really new, but they're newly dominant or at least emerging. I don't know if it's a majority of the industry, but it's certainly a growing part of the industry that does human-centered design and user research as a part of the software development practice. Those skills need to be acquired by coders. The whole team needs to participate. And of course, you need somebody who's going to structure the research plan and do the outreach to the individual customers or prospective customers who maybe are not going to be spending their time coding and maybe they don't even know how to code. But then the coders need to be involved in that process, or I don't think we have the right outcomes.
Right. Okay. So we've highlighted kind of the educational transformation that we're undergoing. We've highlighted the need for diversity. And RailsBridge and Bridge Foundry, these two organizations that you're involved in, are both instrumental in trying to inspire the sort of change that we need to remedy these problems or these changes. So what is RailsBridge? So
RailsBridge was started in 2009 as really it was an organization that grew out of the Rails community and out of a desire to create the community that we wanted to be in. That there were a number of people who felt that some of the louder voices in the Ruby and Rails community were not representative of what the kind of environment that we wanted to work in. We wanted to create an environment where new coders, whether they were Java programmers or Windows programmers or people who'd never written a line of code before, would feel welcome, and that our software and our events would be places that would welcome all sorts of different kinds of people.
And so this selection bias in the Ruby community led to sort of an egregious disproportion of men versus women, although I'm sure there are all kinds of other axes that define underrepresentation. We could talk about minority statuses, so on. So in 2009, you kind of had this realization. What was the gender distribution like back then, and perhaps the ethnic distributions that were alarming to you, and how has this changed in the last 6 or 7 years?
So in 2009, Ruby was very similar to open source in general. There had been two studies a couple of years before that determined that in open source, all contribution, not just coding, but community management or documentation, had 2 to 3% women, which is much, much less than the numbers at the time were saying that as industry as a whole, software development had 25 to 30% of women, depending on how you count. And
as I understand, our population is 50%.
It's actually more than 50%, I think. But
okay.
But then we were also seeing, I don't know statistics on it, but we were also seeing anecdotally that in the San Francisco Ruby community where we started, it was predominantly white, not even a lot of Asians. And I think that has a lot to do with the San Francisco tech scene at that time was predominantly white. And, whereas I think in the South Bay, you saw more of an Asian population and very young. That there was when I was starting in the industry in the 90s, it was the prevailing wisdom was that, adults started companies. You had to have 10 to 20 years of experience before you could actually start a company. And then most people today don't realize that this celebration of young founders and this feeling we have to fund the 20-something things was really new in the 2000s, right? Or maybe late 90s. That before that, if you wanted to found a company straight out of college, you had to find, a quote grown up to co-found with you, or you wouldn't be taken seriously. So we were in this kind of startup situation where a lot of very young people with a bias that, if you're 30 something, or God forbid, 40 or 50 something, not only are you not likely to know this new technology, but you probably can't learn it, right? Which is
ageism.
Ageism, indeed. This feeling that if you've been around for a while, that's actually going to inhibit you from learning. See,
this is one of the most insane things that I've really kind of wanted to attack, or I shouldn't say attack, but at least disentangle on Software Engineering Daily. This idea that we have this neuroplasticity that just breaks down over time, and we become frozen in the set of skills. We become completely unable to reinvent ourselves. I think this is one of the craziest societal myths that we have pervading our world.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And what it's missing is that, this wisdom that people who have 10 or 20 or 30 years of experience really bring to the table, that they understand, independent of the human patterns, that they know how to show up and work and facilitate conversations and manage people and all of that, but that technically they understand patterns, that there are things that I have been doing in software, right, since, I started in the 80s and 90s that I'm still doing today, that they're not the language and the syntax, they're the patterns, and that I draw from that experience to make really good software. And I know people who were programming in the 60s or 70s that I really value when I have the opportunity to work with them, because they really understand the roots of our industry. They understand protocols, all the quote new graphic stuff we're doing on iPhones, I was doing in college. And I think that if we could grow a greater appreciation of what people with different experiences bring to the table, it's going to make us much more powerful as software development teams.
Right. Okay. So let's get back to talking about the women issue specifically. They can almost use this as the base case for any sort of, diversity problem, because the women issue is so egregiously disimbalanced. So why are women so underrepresented in tech? Is there this assumption that maybe these women aren't in tech because they're not interested? Like where is this coming from?
That is a great question. I mean, I think the answer is all the things, right? There is bias in our society at all levels, right? We are seeing this in every single industry. Every single industry is tackling this in some way that has been historically male dominated. And, how do we create opportunities for everyone? So there's a societal problem with, leadership, with expertise, that somehow, women are only qualified to do things that are somehow biologically linked. And then there's this sort of crazy notion that women are somehow less capable in math and science, which has, been proven to be untrue. There's actually, if you ever want to think about things in a different way, there's a fabulous essay by Gloria Steinem called If Men Could Menstruate, which is like, well, then, of course, they would be better astronomers because they're in touch with the cycles of the heavens. And,
yes,
they would brag about how much and how long and, like all about the ways that if they, if men could have this capability, then it would make them more expert in some way.
I love it. That's a great commentary.
But back to your question. So I think we have these societal problems, right, that cause women to have be shut out in some way from all sorts of industries. And then we have sort of this tech-specific challenge. And we have all of the kids stuff where, like, they've done studies where when there's one computer in the house, sits in the boys' room. And that's a thing, right? But I think
that's absolutely true. I had never thought about that one. I don't think my sister had a computer growing up. Then I'm, from a upper middle class family. There's no reason why my sister should not have been at least exposed to the same degree that my brothers were given opportunity. And I shouldn't comment on that because I don't know that. But now that's just one of these strange things, you get pointed out to you that these subtle societal signals, and the closer you look, there's more and more and more and more of these.
Right. And what's really interesting, I think, about the software industry is it completely defies logic, because the software industry was created by women. So in the 40s, largely because of the war, the men were, there wasn't that many men available to do the work, during the war that supported these new machines. But then there was the feeling that the difficult work was creating the machines, and that creating the programming was something that you could give to, kind of secretaries. Of course, they hired women math majors who were at the top of their game to do the software programming. But all of the software development during the war was really done by these women math majors. And then
who were called computers.
Yeah, so they had been doing stuff with slide rules. So they were there. There's a fabulous book called When Computers Were Human. And they used to refer to it, like in the 30s and 20s, as pink collar work. Because if you were a woman mathematician, there was actually little opportunity for you, except in these roles, which were very intellectually demanding, but not considered to be. It was considered to be kind of more support work. And so anyhow, our industry was really created by women, but when it was recognized as an industry, it became a male-dominated industry. But all throughout the 60s and 70s, Barbara Liskov, and she might have been even later, the Liskov
distributed
principle.
Systems pioneer.
Exactly. And, incredible women inventing algorithms, the subroutine was invented by a woman. This history is not well understood. Right, well known, well documented, and recently people keep unearthing oh yeah, this thing, it was invented by a woman. She just it didn't get into the common thinking, and the common narrative about programming. So there's this sort of myth about what our history is, right? That isn't associated with reality. And then the other thing that is a huge dynamic today is that the women who do become, get computer science degrees or enter the field are then leaving maybe faster than they're arriving, which I don't think is technically possible, except that there were more before, right? So I think that since, in the 80s, we got to, I think, almost 40% women graduating with computer science degrees. And then, of course, only, I think, 40% of people in our industry have computer science degrees. So you have people coming in from all different fields.
So these are women who enter the workforce maybe as a software engineer. While they're in the software engineering workforce, they receive so many repeated microaggressions or miniature signals that they do not belong, that they are subjugates of their male counterparts, and they just get fed up and leave.
Yep. And some of these women they go do other things, and they're super accomplished, right? They just stop being software engineers. So statistically, women who get computer science degrees, 2/3 of them leave before they've been in the industry for 3 years. And then of the rest of the population, which are some have CS degrees and some don't, by the 10-year mark, half will have left. So we have hundreds of thousands of women with computer science degrees who are just not working as software developers. We have this huge untapped potential. And my theory is, they talk about supply and demand. They think that we have a supply problem in, underrepresented minorities and women. I think we have a demand problem where we don't have, we have a different supply problem where we don't have enough good jobs where anybody would want to work.
Yes. Engineers love automation, and Wealthfront automates your investing. As a software engineer, there are certain processes that you want to execute no matter what, like integration tests during a build. You wouldn't execute integration tests manually. You would use a continuous integration tool like CodeShip or Jenkins to automate your integration tests. Wealthfront is a tool to automate investing. Just like a continuous integration tool runs your tests automatically, Wealthfront can reinvest your dividends automatically and perform tax loss harvesting automatically. To get your first $15,000 managed by Wealthfront for free, go to wealthfront.com/SEDaily and get started with Wealthfront's layer of automation on top of your portfolio. Wealthfront.com/SEDaily. Check it out. It would support Software Engineering Daily, and you will get $15,000 managed for free if you sign up. Automate your investing. Get back to the things that you can't automate, like writing code. So, we could talk about the problem and the surrounding problems for a long time. Let's talk about the solutions. So you've worked on RailsBridge, you work on Bridge Foundry. I want to go back to the first workshop that you did with RailsBridge. So, you noticed this crazy gender distribution. You said, I want to do something about this. You announced a workshop to do what?
So I noticed that I had been meaning to learn Rails for like 3 years. Like I always have like 6 or 7 things I want to learn. And then I was like, okay, I bet there are other women like me. If we just threw a workshop where we taught Rails and Ruby, then some of those women might want to stay in the community or find Ruby jobs.
And I'll just interject. Rails is like the most pleasurable experience I've had onboarding with any type of framework. I don't know if you share that experience across your computing career that is longer than mine, but for me, it was a really, really just enjoyable experience end to end, from Rails new whatever to having something that was a working app that I could share with people.
So I think if your goal is to learn Rails, it is a great experience. If your role is to be productive quickly in doing something complex and you have experience as a software developer, it is nutty. Like I knew MVC, I watched MVC happen, right? I go into Rails and also like Rails names patterns as if its implementation is the pattern, right? It's a little funny, and it doesn't always get it the way that you would expect. Like the MVC pattern in Rails, like you've got these, like it took me the longest time to unwind the fact that, you're in a controller and you make a instance variable that is available in your view, which is another like class. So wait, is it still object-oriented programming? I thought this was Ruby. What's going on?
So anyway, okay, there's deliberations around the practicality or whatever. We should talk about RailsBridge, I guess.
So, but all I want to say is that it's deceptively easy and it's very quick that you get to a cliff where getting good enough to do something complex is then completely hard to grapple with, right?
But perfect for new developers because then they're hooked at that point.
Yes, one would hope. So what we did intentionally was to build excitement from both non-programmers and programmers to use this this framework. What we did unintentionally is we created what some people would refer to as a community of practice. So we created a network of people who were women and men who were all connected to each other, all learning at the same time and sharing skills, which means that when you hit this cliff, you have people to talk to, which typically as a woman, it's a little awkward to be the only woman in the virtual room when you have questions, right? And all your quote friends might be somebody who wants to date you, and that's kind of weird. Or like you go to these meetups and somebody thinks you're in recruiting, and like it can get in the way of the actual learning. But so
you accidentally created a network effect within a mostly female Ruby on Rails introductory environment, which was perfect because the canonical thing that was happening in this type of workshop is the new developer starts learning. If she's a woman, she gets to this cliff where it gets really complex and difficult. The only people she can ask are males, which is not inherently a problem, but it's much better for her to be in an environment where she's surrounded by plenty of females that she can talk to.
Yeah, and I think that like dudes run into that cliff too, but they have more resources.
Yep. So you had this first workshop. You started to, I guess. So what was the sequence of events that unfolded where you started to realize this type of network effect was happening?
So we had the first workshop, which originally we had 40 spots, and then because we had a wait list, we expanded to 80. We had 63 people show up, 8 teachers, half women, half men teachers, lots of TAs, childcare. It was really awesome. And that
sounds magical.
It was so fun. And people were really excited about the whole phenomenon. Like the whole community came out and supported us. And then afterwards, people were like, how do we help? And so the next workshop we had at Pivotal Labs, they generously hosted us in the city. And what surprised me is we had a lot of people who had been to the first workshop also come to the second workshop. And this became a pattern, which I didn't expect because our plan...
Compound interest.
Well, it was the same curriculum, right? So you wouldn't expect that
I know.
Somebody would do that. But what it turns out that since we had different levels and you could do entry point at different levels and they were small groups, so that each teacher would kind of take it in whatever direction their students would want to learn. So it was a really great environment for people would rebuild the same app over and over again and get a little deeper, like be able to ask those questions. Like, okay, what's exactly going, like when I do, Rails generate model or scaffold, like what's all this code? What is the, so you could dive into different parts of the app and then over time become more expert. And then we would encourage the TAs to then teach. Like, so people would go from student to TA to teacher. And that learning path is a very, very effective one. And what we've seen subsequently, like in subsequent years, I really recognized that the best teachers were the newest learners. And then we would put the experts in the TA role. Because it's much harder to go like untangle what some weird thing somebody's typed than it is to like give the performance. But then what happens is that when you give them the instruction, somebody will ask a question, you don't know the answer, and it creates a collaborative environment when then the TA answers and then you learn, and you're actually learning how we do software, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you talk about concepts? How do you problem solve together? And what I realized more recently is we started to expose this very different culture in software development to people who were new to it.
So there were some counterintuitive lessons that you learned along the road to building this organization. So at a certain point, RailsBridge is getting popular and you start thinking about scaling it. It starts to move to other cities naturally. What happens?
So yeah, the first year, we sort of randomly went to other cities. Like Sarah May was invited to go to Hawaii and give a talk. I from the East Coast. I went to Cambridge, and we kind of did workshops wherever we went, and saw that it was really replicable. And then, but our plan had been to do this for 1 year. But and that our goal was to get to 20%, to go from 3 to 18% in 1 year. And what we were tracking was the number of women who showed up to the meetups. And we actually met that goal 6 months later.
Nice. Very nice.
And so then we really had a brainstorm where it was actually Oren Teich at Heroku who said, if money wasn't an issue, like suppose you just, not that we can give you like an infinite amount of money, but like what would it take to just blow the top off this thing? And what we realized was we are often getting sponsorships from companies who were trying to hire Rails engineers. And so it wasn't like trivial to get sponsorships, but that wasn't the hard thing. The hard thing was actually getting people to step up and play the organizer role, and connecting the money to the people, right? So that we then sort of developed a mantra, is that we would let nothing get in the way of having a workshop.
That's a great mantra. And this touches on one of the things that has kind of cropped up as a theme in a couple places along the shows that we've done on Software Engineering Daily, this idea that leadership is extremely scarce. And I guess, maybe this comes back to the whole assembly line, industrial age baked into us type of thing, but nobody teaches leadership. Nobody stresses it. And I think there's almost in the programming community, I think there's almost a notion of shame around, stepping up and being a leader. I don't know if there's this sort of like underdog thing associated with programming. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but or like this allergy to management. But so how have you solved that problem? How have you gotten people to become leaders of RailsBridge meetups or workshops?
That's actually a great observation about leadership. I think there is this people have this assumed correlation that technical skill and leadership are not correlated. In fact, inversely correlated, right? But in fact, my experience is that as people develop leadership skills, they become better technologists, right? Because they're defining problems, they're putting out solutions, right? Even if they're just doing it with their code. And so what we found is that people really, what I noticed, and this is anecdotally, that women and men would come to the leadership roles differently. Often you'd ask people why they were teaching, and men would say, well, I want to improve my communication skills. I see this as a networking opportunity. And women, it was really philanthropic, right? So women would say, well, I got a lot out of this organization. I want to give back, or I want to give other women the opportunity that I had, which is, I think, really interesting, right? So we're in this environment, right, where open source is very, very few women. And people say, and rightfully so, women don't have spare time in our society, right? Women do most of the childcare. Women are responsible for their families, sometimes elder care. Women are responsible for most of the, household cleaning stuff. I mean, not in my house because I suck at that, but other women do that kind of work, and sometimes are obliged to. And they often have to be more self-sufficient because they're not as entitled as their male peers. So why are we, some people challenge us, why are we demanding this, right, of our women leaders? But if you look at volunteer work, like the PTA is dominated by women, like, nonprofits are typically dominated by women volunteers. But, why do we consider open source not that? So I think that so back to your leadership question. Sorry, went off on a little rant there. I think that we really set it as an expectation. So at the end of every workshop, I typically say, hey, did you like this? Did you get a lot out of it? And I've never been at a workshop where everybody wasn't, yes, it was amazing. Changed my world. And then I say, well, if you want this to continue, we're an all volunteer organization. We need volunteers. And that one of the things that we did that was very effective, I'm not sure that everybody would have done this, but Sarah and I were both, I was like running my own company. It was a small consulting company, so I was still coding at that time. Sarah was a full-time coder. We were both moms, we had little kids at home. Like, this was not an easy lift for us. So we made a commitment to each other to do this for a year. In January, which was a little over halfway through the year, Sarah May and Elin and I, Elin was our volunteer coordinator for the first year, got together and we made these workshop recipes where we wrote down all the things that we do so that other people could do it. And then at every workshop, I said, we need new organizers. Because the first year, Sarah May and I organized every single workshop. And nobody stepped up. And then finally, in April, I asked 2 women to co-organize a workshop. And so the May workshop, May or June, was organized by Melanie Archer and I can't remember. But these 2 women who are awesome leaders. And then at the end of the workshop, there was nothing on the calendar, and people said, when's the next workshop? And I said, I don't know. There will be another workshop when someone organizes one. And
interesting.
I think that, like, sometimes you have to leave space for leaders.
Right. That's fascinating. It's so tricky to teach this, and it's I think it's impossible to get to the point to where we have like too many leaders. Like, I think everybody could be a leader, and that would be the ideal scenario. So I don't know if you're listening to this and you've spent a lot of your day like complaining about the problems in your organization. Probably you can improve some of those by becoming a leader, but that's more broad advice. So let's talk about the extrapolation of RailsBridge to Bridge Foundry. You learned these counterintuitive lessons about building an organization, about the workshop model, about the fact that you can't just inject money into this organization and have it grow like a weed. So you took these lessons and you replicated it in the form of Bridge Foundry. What is Bridge Foundry? So
first, RailsBridge grew all over the world, right? So we spent a few years just geographic expansion, and we had this.
Can we get some stats?
When I last checked about a year ago, we were in 52 cities globally, where some of them, like San Francisco will often have 2 workshops a month. Sometimes it's 1 a quarter. Sometimes it's, different meters in different places. But they're typically teams of people who are taking turns doing this workshop organizing and teaching. And we've replicated this. Students become TAs, become teachers. And then the organizer, it's always a challenge to find organizers. And over time, we keep working on how to create those leadership roles in ways that are supportive and helpful to people. So in a few years, RailsBridge grew all over the world, and the workshops did. But RailsBridge, the organization, had these other projects. So it was originally not just the workshops. We had a Teaching Kids initiative. We had we did like a kids track at RubyConf in I think 2011. We did there's a Rails Mentors. It's like this online site for people to like help each other. And there were like a dozen different little projects, but it was the workshops that really took off, and people started using RailsBridge like as a noun. Like, we're going to have a RailsBridge this weekend. So we recognized that RailsBridge had become synonymous with the workshops. Well, at the same time, there were all of our stuff, all of our materials, our processes is explicitly open source. Anyone can take our materials. You can do anything with them. If you call it RailsBridge, it must be free and it must be an outreach activity. But if you want to just use our materials to learn and teach in your office, go team. We want this, we want people to learn stuff. And so what happened is there were other organizations that were just like, okay, there were like 3 different Python organizations, the Boston Python workshops and PyLadies and PyStar, that like borrowed the model and made things happen. And there was a Scala workshop. But what we noticed is that we welcomed people of other technologies to work with us, but people didn't. They made it their own separate organizations, which is formally what we said was fine. But we thought there'd be more power if we all banded together and shared a little more closely. So we had this hypothesis that the name was getting in the way. So what we did was we took the organization, what we say is we refactored the organization. So Bridge Foundry became the name of everything that wasn't the Rails workshops. And then RailsBridge was just the Rails workshops.
Great. So some of the things that have grown out of this refactoring are Mobile Bridge, Clojure Bridge, Go Bridge. And so these are respectively, mobile development, development with the language Go, and development with the language Clojure. So Go and Clojure, for example, I often think of these as more advanced languages. Maybe that's maybe I'm off base on that, but like, are the goals with meetups like Clojure Bridge and Go Bridge, are they similar to those of RailsBridge, or are you catering to more advanced programmers?
Well, there are people who say that functional programming is a lot simpler than object-oriented programming, right? There was a time that people thought object-oriented programming was advanced, right?
Right. It's intuitive. We're interacting with these digital objects just like real-world objects.
Right. But, before that, there was procedural programming, which is do this, do this, do this, do this. And that object-oriented programming was like fancier at one point. So I think that whatever you learn first is the easy thing. And that certainly I think for certain types of people, functional and certain types of problems, functional programming is certainly easier. And so it's really about having different entry points. And it's really about, I think, leveraging people's like motivation and excitement.
Right. Okay. So yeah, we had Brian Kernahan on the show actually, and he was talking about how he doesn't understand. I think this is Brian Kernahan. I'm going to get in trouble if I get this wrong, but he was talking about how he's never really kind of understood the JavaScript inheritance model because he's kind of comes from a C++ or Java background. And then I've talked to people who grew up in a JavaScript world, and they have the converse problem. They don't understand the Java inheritance model as well as the JavaScript model. So it comes. We are rooted. We're anchored in the types of technologies that we start with. So I assume you're saying that because Clojure Bridge and Go Bridge are introductory meetups to new people, new programmers.
Well, all of these things are for both experienced programmers and new programmers. I think we're most well known for the new programmer stuff because I think those are the people who stay in the community the longest. We have, in my experience, we'll always have like at least 20%, probably sometimes half, are people who have programming experience or some programming experience. They come and they spend less time in the workshops because they need it less, right? Like I know a woman who came, she went to one workshop. She was a Java programmer. She went to one workshop. She got a job the next week as a Rails engineer. like, I don't even know if she needed the workshop. I think it was just more of a networking thing. She heard about this job because she went to the workshop. And I think also we see people, like not just women, like men have this problem too. They're Java programmer for 10 years and they want to get into Ruby or, JavaScript or something. And they have no credibility. And people are like, oh, you've been doing this for 10 years. You can't do anything else. But if you go into your interview and you're like, yeah, I learned Rails last weekend, right? It completely changes the conversation.
Absolutely.
So that opportunity to, give people that chance to level up. And, one of the leaders of GoBridge is a Rails engineer who's excited about learning this new language. So she's teaching herself Go because she wants to do something new.
Tell me some success stories of Bridge Foundry and RailsBridge.
So we've had a number of people who started programming because of RailsBridge workshops. And probably most notably Rachel Meyer, who went to the second workshop and was not a programmer and maybe not even sure that she wanted to do it. Who she went to workshop after workshop. She taught herself programming. She did tremendous amount outside of RailsBridge workshops. So that was a big motivator. She became a teacher. She became an organizer and really a leader in our community. And then in less than a year, she was a working software developer. And we have a number of stories like that of people who are new to programming. We also have stories of women who they hear about new opportunities, right? So they come in as an experienced developer. They might be coming in to help teach, or they might be coming in to learn a different technology, like they're learning mobile instead of Rails or vice versa. And then they get exposed to new opportunities because of the network effect. And I think the other thing that we're doing, which when Sarah May, who co-founded RailsBridge with me, and I were 6 months in brainstorming, well, what are we doing anyhow? Like, is this a jobs program or is this, something different? Like, we really found that we valued the people who weren't becoming programmers as part of this. Like, we saw women who would be they'd be a CMO, right? They're chief marketing officer of their company. And they would come in and they would just I just want to understand what my engineers are doing. And so they're just becoming more technically conversant. They're gaining credibility with their team. They're becoming more facile with the technology, or it's just fun, right? And I remember hearing this story from somebody who had brought her friend who was a designer. So this woman had never installed software on her machine before. She would get the IT guys to install Photoshop when there was a new version, right? And in the RailsBridge workshops, we require you to, the Friday night, we have beer and pizza and what we call an install fest. Because that's the hard, awful part where you have to be let me install Xcode and these different, brew install this and all this command line stuff.
What is this? I've never even used this command line thing before.
Right. And you have to know Unix commands. You don't even know what Unix is. This is a whole interface to your machine you've never seen. And then it goes wrong sometimes, right? Oh, you have this version of that. And, let's go untangle that. And so here was somebody who had just never even double clicked installed anything. And then she ends this weekend and she's like, that wasn't that hard. So she's just gained a whole set of just tech skills. So what Sarah called that
general tech skills.
She called it raising the ambient level of technology amongst women.
Wow. Okay. So I love that because I have been trying to get my mom and my sister to engage with coding and technology at some more granular level. And I'm certainly going to point them to this episode to listen to. I've been trying to do this for 3 or 4 years, and I just have not made any progress. And it's really frustrating to me because I know that it's It's like looking at a hammer from a distance, being like, I don't know what that thing is for. But once you pick it up and like you use it one or two times, you instantly know, oh, this is how all these things in the world work. This explains nails to me.
And I think it's hard because the beginning stuff for coding is the boring shit, right? Like, when I first did, the first time I installed Rails, like it took me 3 days, and I mean it was a long time ago. It wasn't as easy as now, but it was like I had to, figure out some incompatibility with something or other, and and then it gets fun because you're like, oh, now I can Rails new, and I can like IRB and whatever. But that installation part is really like, I don't know, maybe some people like that. I don't. And I think that it's not just like, there's a lot of people in the world, right, who don't like, that becomes a barrier, right? And they think that that's what coding is, because that's what they're first exposed to. And I think it's important to break that down. And that's why I think we should one of the reasons I think we should teach kids to code, because I think that all this stuff needs to be demystified, and they need to have that fun experience so they know the difference.
Perfect segue. So should every kid learn to code?
Absolutely.
Okay. And what are the hurdles? I mean, I'm sure you've looked at this landscape and you understand this landscape much better than I do. What are the hurdles to getting every kid introduced to code to the degree that we need to?
Well, I think there's a bunch of hurdles. I think it's really unfortunate that we have a new generation of computers where you have to install a whole bunch of stuff before you start coding. It's very inaccessible now, which I think is really unfortunate. When I started coding, I'm glad we have a graphical user interface, but it was fun. Like you open the computer, there was a command line. You could be like, print, Sarah is amazing, go to 10, and then you have a whole screen full of Sarah's amazing.
You're referring to Windows machines, I guess?
And my first machine was an Apple II.
Okay.
So you would type BASIC right into the terminal. And so it's gotten a little better. I mean, I was horrified when the iPhone and the iPad came out, when they actually forbid you from making development environments on the iPad when it came out, which I found like just the worst possible thing that could be done for a generation, right? This has been corrected, but I think we've lost some of that initial enthusiasm to develop the kinds of things that would empower kids. Like kids should get a machine that should be accessible for them to make stuff on it.
So what you're saying is the first computer many kids get is an iPhone or a iPad, and these computers, people don't even think of them as computers, really. Think of them as communication devices or phones. Couldn't be further from the truth. And these do not make it easy to program, whereas a desktop computer is now a desktop computer is the de facto way to code. There is nothing inherently prohibitive about coding on a mobile device other than the fact that Apple has kind of sandboxed that functionality away.
Yeah, and I think the same thing, like, I don't know, a tablet that has like a really good interface. Right? It's not considered to be a significant market, and there isn't motivation, I guess, to do it, or maybe we just don't. I don't know why. It just isn't. But then even the desktop environments are not as accessible as they were in like the 80s for coding, right? And because they just don't come with, right? The Apple II came with a basic manual. And I don't know whether that's the solution, but it's currently, there's a very difficult entry point for kids. And then the other thing is at school, at least in San Francisco, and I think that this is common in in the United States, that it's dominated by Windows machines that are completely locked down. And if kids are introduced to coding, they're introduced to these fake things. Like kids really like to learn real things. Like they can detect that they're learning some fake kids thing. And that's fine if it's like, they don't mind a fake kids thing that's like Halo.
So like this Angry Birds coding interface, like the code.org stuff, is that not up your alley?
Well, I think that that's positive direction.
A little too reductive.
I think that my ideal environment for kids would they would be building things that are real applications in some way.
Yeah.
Right. Like when I learned BASIC, I was writing the same code that people were writing when they wrote applications that you bought.
They sense the veneer.
Absolutely.
The little kids sense the veneer. Yeah. I mean, I wish I would have been doing programming instead of playing Incredible Machine, which is kind of like this game that is where you solve problems. I mean, whatever. I have no right to complain. I learned plenty from that, and it was really enjoyable.
But games are not the same thing. Like, I think problem-solving games are good, but they're not the same thing as coding.
Yes.
And I think kids should be taught utility stuff. Like, suppose, I mean, a little older than, like, whatever, preschool or whatever. But, like, they need to be able to reason with data. Like, we have so much information now. Like, what if they could, what if they were doing a biology experiment and they collected a bunch of data and then they like put it in a spreadsheet and then they will be able to do a statistical analysis on it. Like, people think that that's super advanced, except it's not. Like, I was teaching science to a bunch of first graders, and I talked to a friend of mine about who's a scientist, and I said, well, is hypothesis too big a word for these first graders? And she said, they all know what a Tyrannosaurus is. I think we don't give our kids, especially elementary school kids, enough credit for how smart they are.
Yes, we do. We infantilize. It sounds like, we infantilize the young and we accuse the old of being locked into their neuroplasticity. The world is only for 20 and 30 somethings. False conclusions. So I want to begin to close off and wrap this conversation up. Like this idea of that everyone should learn to code or be exposed to code. I think there is some pushback to this, and I think it's crazy. I think it's like these, this like 3% of scientists who don't think that climate change is a thing, and they're so loud about it that they actually have some sort of sway. I think at this point, it's like not even a debate. Every kid should be exposed to code or learn how to code. I think that should be the changing narrative. But well, to close off, I mean, just to exemplify why it is important for everybody to be exposed to code or to learn to interact with coders at a bare minimum. A few weeks ago, you wrote about cultural change facilitated by software. This post is not directly about Bridge Foundry, I don't think, but the subject is relevant. How is software changing our culture, and how can it change our culture going into the future to give a brighter, more diverse future?
We are so much more empowered as individuals now in this generation than ever before, at least potentially, right? With all due respect to the digital divide and that not everyone actually has access, I think that problem could be solved. There's a bunch of people working on that. But even with the people who have access, they're not actually being empowered by the technology that they have access to because of this missing piece of education. I think a lot about how in the early days of this country, we had a very well-educated populace, which was unusual. It was more people who had more ability to read and write than in Europe. So I've read. And with those words, we created a country. We created a democracy. We created the expectation of how we would have individual rights. Now, in this day and age, we can exercise those individual rights in fundamentally different ways if we can access this technology that surrounds us, if we can actually control it and actually create. And I think that is the opportunity. We have an opportunity for participatory democracy in ways that we've never really been able to before, because our ability to participate in our society transcends where we are physically. It transcends our physical capabilities. It is completely independent of these superficial attributes of race and gender and age and all of these things. So that's why I think there's an urgency for everyone, no matter what age they are right now, with whatever their station, whatever their role is in society, to be able to be actively creating our new society. And I think technology can facilitate that.
Well, that's a great place to stop. Sarah Allen, thanks for an amazing conversation. Thank you for coming back on the show. It's been really great having you. And of course, if you have any news or interesting things to discuss in the future, feel free to come back on. It's been a pleasure having you on Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you.